situated 20 kilometers to the northwest of the Utah Beach Museum, in a bay that translates into English as the Wolf's Ass, is WN25 La Redoute. Redoute meaning fort. It has the name because it was once the location of a French fort that actually replaced Roman and Viking fortifications. The fort was built to defend against the English, and in fact the bay that it once covered saw numerous English landings, the most famous of which was on July 12, 1346 by King Edward III. It would mark the beginning of a series of large-scale raids that devastated the wealthy region of Normandy and saw the English knocking on the gates of Paris. The campaign culminated in the Battle of Crécy, giving it the name the Crécy Campaign. It was part of the 100 Years' War with the French. It was a pivotal campaign that not only established longbows wielded by British and Welsh archers as a devastating weapon of war, but the French humiliation at Crécy resulted in the fall of Calais that would remain in English hands for over 200 years. The invasion I just mentioned and the constant threat of attack by the British resulted in the French building forts all the way along the northern coastline of France, with 12 covering this small bay alone. Here is an old map showing a number of them, including more fortifications on Tattoo Island, Revel Point, and in the area of Vasselhogue. The Germans destroyed the fort in July 1942 to make way for the resistance nest that was started in that same year. The fact they destroyed it would lead me to believe it was in a terrible state of repair after it was abandoned in 1856, because the Germans were more than happy to utilise any pre-existing defences, with several examples on Utah Beach alone. The battery was manned by elements of the 919th Grenadier Regiment that belonged to the 709th Infantry Division. The main firepower here consisted of two 8.8cm field guns. These were housed in two R677 casemates. The southern casemate is relatively intact and a similar design to the R680 casemate I showed you at WN140. The gun would be wheeled in from the rear, through two armoured doors that are also long gone, past the typical ammunition niches to the left and right, and the trailing arms would then lock into the tracks either side behind the gun. It also had the same fume extraction design, but here the extractor housing has been taken for scrap, unlike at WN140 where it still remains. However, the second R677 casemate does require a little bit of imagination, with it being completely destroyed. But it does have a really interesting feature, and the only intact part of the entire casemate. In front of the gun's opening is a small pit, complete with iron rungs to climb down inside. I'm pretty sure this was for spent shell casings that could be delivered via a hole in the floor of the casemate coming out of a small tube in the back wall. It can't be a machine gun nest, as the concussion of the main gun going off could be fatal for anyone in there. The southern casemate looks south down the coast towards Kinnerville, and the northernmost casemate covered the bay and the gap towards Vasselhogue Peninsula. The bay between them is now the home of oyster farming, is very prevalent in the area. There are also a couple of features that would have been incorporated into the now heavily damaged seawall. These, if you look closely, have small niches built into them, possibly for ammunition or comms equipment. They're almost identical and are more than likely basic machine gun or observation posts built to bolster the site's defence. They are not as substantial as some positions I'll show you in a minute. Also placed along the seawall is a single U-shaped Tobruk between the main casemates. It once had a captured French FT-17 turret mounted. This was taken from a World War I era French tank. It is actually the first tank to be fitted with a fully traversing turret. Although it faced out to sea, it was capable of covering the majority of the battery. There was also a several 100-metre long masonry wall that could be easily mistaken as an anti-tank wall built by the Germans. This was actually built by the French in the 18th century to protect the fort against coastal erosion. These early hand-drawn maps, showing the now long-gone salt marshes, illustrate quite how far inland the now water's edge fort was. Now to show you the structures further inland. Directly behind the intact southernmost R677 casemate is another sorry-looking bunker for either ammunition or crew. Climbing down through a hole in what was once the roof you were greeted by the evidence of a blast that was capable of lifting several feet of reinforced concrete into the air and away from its supporting walls. Further towards the western side is what remains of the doorway. Behind the shelter is some dense vegetation that conceals the first 1694 anti-tank gun position. Unfortunately, I couldn't get access. Then, covering the majority of the battery and the southern approach, is a machine gun Tobruk. 30 metres behind that is the second 1694 ring stand, also once housing a 5cm anti-tank gun. Slightly overgrown, so here is an example of what it should have looked like with the gun mounted. Just behind this is another machine gun Tobruk, protecting the southern and eastern flanks. Once again, some imagination required. It is, however, similar to the first machine gun Tobruk. There are a couple more shelters with their entrances protected by blast walls closer to the sea. Sadly, as with many other little known sites, WN25 is slowly being reclaimed by not only nature, but also farmers. If you know where to look, you can still see evidence of what lies beneath the surface. Some clues lie in the form of markers to warn the farmers that an obstacle is there. Others take a little more digging. Be warned, although most of the entrances have purposely been buried at some point to stop access for one reason or another, some have been missed and offer the unsuspecting explorer a nice healthy drop into some time in hospital. One thing I've learnt exploring these sites over the years is that brambles and nettles seem to like concrete. So, not always, but a lot of the time, if you see a strange patch of growth, it may well be worth a look. They tend to remain because it would not be worth the time to remove the reinforced concrete, so why clear the vegetation? What I do find strange about WN25 is there are no defensive positions on the northwestern corner, so they must have relied on the long-gone trench systems, barbed wire and mines to cover this side. The area was liberated by the Americans around the 22nd of June 1944, although many Germans had already retreated north to Fortress Cherbourg.